We have two texts that we're going to be looking at. One is a sacred text in Isaiah, and the other one comes from Blaise Pascal. They're both in your handout. I want to start by reading those two texts. Again, the first one is Isaiah chapter 6, verses 1 through 6. In the year that King Uzziah died, I saw the Lord sitting upon a throne, high and lifted up, and the train of his robe filled the temple. Above him stood the seraphim. Each had 6 wings. With 2 he covered his face, and with 2 he covered his feet, and with 2 he flew. And one called to another and said, Holy, holy, holy is the Lord of hosts. The whole earth is full of his glory. And the foundations of the threshold shook at the voice of him who called, and the house was filled with smoke. And I said, Woe is me, for I am lost. For I am a man of unclean lips, and I dwell in the midst of a people of unclean lips. For my eyes have seen the King, the Lord of hosts. Then one of the seraphim flew to me, having in his hand a burning coal that he had taken with tongs from the altar. And he touched my mouth and said, Behold, this has touched your lips. Your guilt is taken away, and your sin atoned for. And I heard the voice of the Lord saying, Whom shall I send? And who will go for us? Then I said, Here I am, send me. The second text comes from Blaise Pascal, who was a 17th century mathematician and philosopher, from his work Pensées, which is a French word for thoughts. This was Pascal's work on apologetics that he actually died. He died as a very young man before he had completed it. So it was kind of put together by others, and it's just a series of meditations, and this is one of them. He wrote this, The greatness of men is so evident that it is even proved by his wretchedness. For what in animals is nature, we call in man wretchedness, by which we recognize that, his nature now being like that of animals, he has fallen from a better nature which once was his. For who is unhappy at not being a king except a deposed king? Was Paulus Emilius unhappy at being no longer consul? On the contrary, everybody thought him happy in having been consul, because the office could only be held for a time. But men thought Perseus so unhappy in being no longer king, because the condition of kingship implied his being always king. That they thought it's strange then that he endured life. Who is unhappy at having only one mouth? And who is not unhappy at having only one eye? Probably no man ever ventured to mourn at not having 3 eyes, but anyone is inconsolable at having none. Creation contains an astonishing abundance of beauty that should constantly amaze and delight us. Even something so common as a tree is a work of wonder with the vast variety of sizes, colors, and shapes that it can possess. Thus, each day we are barraged not just by breathtaking sights and sundry smells, but by the sweet sounds of this glorious world. And yet often, such pageantry fails to even penetrate our perception, much less provoke our praise. In fact, we can get so caught up in the mundane that we respond to such rapture with resentment, as the following Robert Frost poem that's also in your handout illustrates. I have wished a bird would fly away and not sing by my house all day, have clapped my hands at him from the door when it seems as if I could bear no more. The fault must partly have been in me. The bird was not to blame for his key. And of course there must be something wrong in wanting to silence any song. This morning when I got to Ken's, I realized I was looking back over my notes, and I titled this sermon on your handout something like Mandating the Mundane. I should have titled it The Silence of Song, and hopefully you'll see why in a little bit. But such an arid attitude toward the astonishing allure of God's universe reveals, I think, a heart with anemic aspirations. One which is willing to exchange the profound time and again for the prosaic, the fantastic for the familiar, the vivid for the vapid. And yet it's not only the world's magnificence which often fails to move us, it's also its malevolence, its evil. Even given such bountiful beauty, the universe is still a place which is amazingly appalling, unnervingly ugly. And one does not have to search far and wide to uncover such disfigurement. Let me give you one example. On May 16th, 1966, which wasn't that long ago, the Chinese Communist Party released a document expressing concern that the bourgeoisie, which would have been the upper class, and counter-revolutionaries were trying to hijack the party. This is Mao's party, of course. The May 16th notification, as it came to be known, would spark the Cultural Revolution in China, which was an all-encompassing political movement that sought to purge the country from any anti-Maoist oppression and even thought. During this time, millions of people were arrested and terrorized by what came to be known as the Red Guards, the Cultural Revolutionaries' paramilitary youth organization, made up of children as young as the age of 12. Those arrested were forced to endure brutal struggle sessions, as they called them, where they were tortured and humiliated in public. So they saw students brutalizing their teachers and children torturing their parents. And in the Guangqi, maybe it's pronounced, province, the suppression tactics were particularly brutal. For these revolutionaries, simply torturing, humiliating, and even killing their enemies was not enough. They believed that rejection of Marxist ideology warranted complete destruction in the most barbaric fashion, which meant, and I'm assuming that the young audience won't know what this word means, but which meant that the dissidents must be cannibalized. In Huaxuan County, where this thinking was most prevalent, victims would be stalked by crowds, and then they would be pounced upon. And then, what the people would do is gather together and have barbecues and banquets with their friends and their family, with children and the elderly taking part in the barbarism. This was a celebration of their achievements in bringing about Mao's utopia. Now, I haven't even gotten to the twisted part yet, but I'm going to skip it because there are children present. But I think you get the sense. But here's the thing. Most of us don't want to hear about such unsettling atrocities in the world because they have a tendency to ruin our day. In fact, if I were to continue to talk about the kinds of things that took place in Mao's China, I don't think that you'd be able to enjoy your lunch later. And so what we typically do is expel these ideas from our minds the moment that they enter, assuring ourselves that the extremities of life must be avoided if we are to have any hope of maintaining a sound psychological state, that a healthy balance must always be struck, that the mundane, in other words, is always to be preferred, not only over the malevolent, but even over the majestic. But once we set aside such modern justifications, we are free to consider what is a more likely reason behind man's retreat from these extreme realities. Why he so brazenly suppresses these kinds of truths concerning the dichotomous nature of our universe. Identifying the fear that causes him to cling to prefer dull fantasies rather than embrace devastating facts. Which, according to Blaise Pascal, in our passage, is essentially this. Man seeks refuge from the imposing beauty and ugliness of this world, this profound paradox concerning creation's simultaneous greatness and wretchedness, because it reminds him of his own duality. That he himself is, in the words of Peter Kreeft, a living oxymoron, a walking contradiction. A being who has a divine-like capacity for truth, goodness, and beauty, but who uses it to commit the most exquisite acts of evil. A creature who was designed to be a king, a ruling priest, but who has been reduced to a devilish pauper. For Pascal, modern man is like a fallen monarch, who, not wanting to be reminded of his former glory, spends his waking hours trying to convince himself that he's just a commoner, that he, in fact, has never been anything more. And yet notice that if he is going to maintain this delusion, he has to do more than just convince himself. He must engage in a relentless task of neutralizing both greatness and wretchedness wherever he finds it, making everything equally mundane so as not to invite any comparisons. In other words, he seeks to turn everyone into a peasant like himself. Which, by the way, may help to explain why so many people today seem so bent on undermining greatness wherever they find it. And one of the victims of this campaign has been physical beauty. Louis Markos begins his book on restoring beauty with a surprising illustration of this campaign to suppress splendor, as we might call it. And it's the animated movie classic Shrek. Now, I'm assuming that most of you have seen this movie, but let me give you a brief synopsis in case you haven't. Set in a mythical once-upon-a-time setting, Shrek the movie is the story of a hulking green ogre who, after being mocked and feared his entire life, retreats to an ugly swamp to live out his existence in happy isolation. However, his serenity is suddenly spoiled when throngs of fairy tale creatures like Pinocchio and Cinderella, the Three Pigs, etc., who have been displaced by the tyrannical king, Lord Farquaad. This is bizarre giving this in a sermon, but whatever. Lord Farquaad. These fairy tale creatures suddenly invade his terrain. So in return for ridding his swamp of these unwanted guests, Shrek agrees to rescue a princess, Fiona, and deliver her to the king. The audience cheers Shrek on as he liberates the princess from her castle prison, only to discover, of course, that there is a catch. The beautiful Fiona is further imprisoned by a spell that causes her to transform into an ogre each night. Luckily, as in all fairy tales, there is a way out of this enchanted enslavement. But only true love's first kiss is powerful enough to break the spell, returning the princess to her true form. And as one would expect, the film slowly builds to the climactic moment when Shrek and Fiona, who is now in the likeness of an ogre, kiss. And in a parody of Disney's Beauty and the Beast, Fiona floats magically upward with beams of light shooting out from her limbs, only then to return gracefully to earth, where we expect her to be transformed once and for all into the beautiful princess. However, in a reversal of expectation, Fiona remains an ogre, and we are assured will continue in that form for the rest of her life. The spell has been broken. She has become what she truly is, ugly. To most modern-day moviegoers, Shrek's shocking portrayal of ugliness as an end in itself goes unnoticed. And yet, even for those few who do consider it, their response is commonly confirmative, exalting the egalitarian ethos that it avows, that great leveling ethic that says that external beauty is nothing. Or as one writer described physical attractiveness, quote, an elitist bourgeois hang-up that needlessly divides and engenders low self-esteem in girls who can't make the grade, close quote. This is, of course, the same drab dogma which eradicated beauty pageants from high schools and colleges, on the grounds that they discriminated against girls who were aesthetically challenged. Which to me seems like eliminating football because it's unfairly biased towards the athletically gifted, a class of which, of course, I am not a part. But in pursuit of the mundane, all value differences, whether physical, cultural, intellectual, moral, or religious, must be eliminated. And thus the beauty bias and the injustice of lookism, according to this approach, must be rectified. This is how justice is defined. And if that means designating unattractive people as a protected class, I'm talking to some of you, and creating affirmative action programs for the homely, and compensating disfigured but otherwise healthy people in personal injury courts, then so be it. Now, why would we do this? Well, it's because ugly lives matter. Now, I jest a little, but this is the spirit of our age, the modern utopia of the dull, where beauty, and soon every form of excellence, is viewed and will be viewed as nothing more than a power play to oppress the plain, and where the pretty then are morally obligated to empty themselves of all privilege, rendering all swans ugly ducklings in the name of fairness. Think about this. This is a fairy tale where rather than the hideous toad being turned into a handsome prince, which is a story of redemption, the princess is turned into an ugly toad, which is a story of imposed forfeiture for the sake of equality. Right? This is the despising of every form of greatness, of exceptionalism. And it's very similar to the bland vision which animated gray communism, by the way, that God is dead and that all human beings need is bread and vodka and cement housing, apparently, as Eric Metaxas put it. This is the desire to silence any song that Robert Frost points to. Brent Curtis and John Eldredge, in their book, The Sacred Romance, again point to the reason behind these attempts to suppress beauty. And this is in your handout. Every woman is in some way searching for or running from her beauty. And every man is looking for or avoiding his strength. Why? In some deep place within, we remember that we were made what we were made to be. We carry with us the memory of image bearers walking in the garden. Now, interestingly, Curtis and Eldredge speak of two paths towards this. Some who are moving their way towards strength and beauty, and others that are fleeing from it. One way to think about that is a couple of weeks ago, we talked about this path towards righteousness. We realize we're fallen. We want to regain that status, regain that righteousness. But how man often does it is through works of self-righteousness. He tries to justify himself in this world, which is a vain attempt. The second that other people will take is to try to flee from that state of greatness that we once held, that man has fallen from. And it's interesting, I don't know if this applies, it could, this is just sort of a connection I made in my mind, but I think for many people the issue was the first of those, right? This mission of self-righteousness, because we live in the modern world, and in America, our ethos, our hero's journey has been one of self-assertion, right? Of going out and, establishing the West and, and moving forward. And so the appeal of self-righteousness would have been greater. But it seems to me there's a shift that's taking place in our culture. We're moving away from self-assertion, probably because we found it be wanting when it comes to ultimate justification. And we're moving more towards a collectivist kind of idea. One where now we have to neutralize everything, where we pretend like there is no such greatness, and we eventually end up in cement housing. So why would anyone take the second of those two options? Why would you want to forget who you really are? Well, it's because the pain of the memory of our past exalted state is so excruciating that we rather fill our days with the banal food and drink of the commoner than consume anything that would remotely remind us of the full-flavored feast of the King from which we've been banished. Now, what makes beauty or greatness, in every form that it takes, so dangerous to this mentality is that it reveals things. Beauty uncovers. It clarifies. It invites comparisons. And so beauty demands honesty. It demands self-assessment. It demands responsibility. Ultimately, it demands surrender. For even a glimpse of majesty reminds us of how far we have fallen. It convicts us of the truth that we were beautifully and wonderfully made, but that we have squandered this original goodness in wasteful living. That we have traded our birthright for a bowl of stew, or a foreign B-movie divorced actress. In other words, we're all Prince Harrys now. That's my point. Come on. And to be confronted with that truth ruins us, as it did Isaiah when he came face to face with the source of all beauty, God Almighty Himself. We have this great scene in our text. It's depicted for us here in Isaiah chapter 6. The Lord is sitting upon the throne. He's high and lifted up, and the train of His robe fills the temple. And these great creatures, the seraphim, are flying around Him. They have 6 wings. With 2 they cover their face, with 2 they cover their feet, and the other 2 they fly. And they call out to one another in thundering voices, "Holy, holy, holy is the Lord of hosts. The whole earth is full of His glory." And the foundations of the thresholds shake at the voice of Him who called. And the house is filled with smoke, the text says. And then Isaiah responds to this great vision this way: "Woe is me, for I am lost. I am ruined," he says. "For I am a man of unclean lips, and I dwell in the midst of a people of unclean lips. For my eyes have seen the King, the Lord of hosts." Isaiah comes face to face with the greatness of God, His infinite holiness, His perfect moral character, His majesty, and it ruins him. It invites a comparison automatically. There is something great and beautiful, and then you look to yourself and say, "I am not great and beautiful. I am fallen and broken and depraved and sinful." But so many today flee from these kinds of majestic manifestations. They can't even take it in a small dose. And here's the thing: when they can no longer find any refuge from it, what they do is just what the scribes and Pharisees did, and they seek to destroy it. They go to great lengths to stamp out beauty wherever they find it. They despise it because it reminds them of who they are. You know, it's kind of interesting that legalism, with the scribes and Pharisees, one of the things they were guilty of, that legalism is its own sort of exalting of the mundane, isn't it? And the destroying of the majestic, of tithing mint and dill and cumin, but despising the weightier matters. It's like majoring in the minors. And this is also clearly true of the contemporary art scene. We looked at movies. It's true if you are into art. If you're into contemporary art, I'll pray for you. But, you know, the end of art, the purpose of art used to be beauty, right? Art was meant to transport you to another world. As Roger Scruton used to like to say, beauty is a traveler from another world that beckons us to come and explore. So beauty was meant to transport you in that way. Art was through beauty. But art now seems to be a competition to see who can be the most ridiculous. I mean, duct taping a banana to a wall, I'm sorry, is not art. even if the artist and their co-conspirators, the critics, say that it is. Art has become like a joke. Once you hear the punchline, you have no more need of it. That's why when somebody ripped the banana off the wall and ate it, nobody cared, right? It's just supposedly sold for all this money, this work of art, but at the end of the day, it's just a banana duct taped to the wall. So we embrace the mundane because it makes no demands upon us. Rather, it invites us to sink slowly and peacefully into the mire of mediocrity. But we must resist such mediocrity. And instead, we are to pursue, with everything in us, excellence, righteousness. But in order to do that, we must embrace our own wretchedness so that we might be raised up from it, just like Isaiah. We must acknowledge the disease of our own heart so that the great physician might heal us. We have to grieve and mourn and weep and turn our laughter into lament and our joy into gloom. We have to own our sin and embrace it and say, yes, I've fallen short. I've sinned against God. I've contaminated and corrupted myself. We have to humble ourselves before the Lord so that He might lift us up, so that we might be cleansed of our iniquities, as Isaiah was, forgiven of our sins, restored and regenerated, and returned to our original state, and to take up the charge once again to go out into the world and to fulfill our mandate, so that we might free others from the prison of the mundane, continuing God's work of recreation, of making all things new. Let me make one last point. The culmination of that project of regeneration, of recreation, culminates in a second vision of Isaiah. Isaiah speaks of the culmination of the new heavens and the new earth. This time it happens in chapter 11. And here we see the recreation of the entire world, which has been healed by the love of God. A world in which the lion and the lamb lie down together. A world in which there will be peace at all levels, in other words, reconciliation right through the cosmos. To which the prophet then exclaims, the world will be filled with the glory of God as the waters cover the sea. It's one of the great exclamations that you find in Scripture. The world will be filled with the glory of God as the waters cover the sea. That last phrase is fascinating, right? Because you'd say, well, how do the waters cover the sea? They are the sea. Well, I think N.T. Wright is onto something when he suggests that this phrase speaks to God's intention to flood the world with Himself, with His holiness and His love in new ways, in which what we already know of the beauty and power and majesty of creation will be taken up and enhanced yet further. When that which is evil and that which defaces God's world will finally be done away with, in God's final work of reconciliation, of beating swords into plowshares and spears into pruning hooks, so that nation will not lift up sword against nation, neither shall they learn war anymore, which is another vision that we find in Isaiah of God's future. And thus the church today, notice, exists at the precipice, straddling the old and the new, the unregenerate and the regenerate, the already and not yet. And given such a place that we stand in, the purpose of this community is to point forward to the coming day of reconciliation through the proclamation of the gospel, and we could say through the creation of beauty, fulfilling the creation mandate. We might call this beauty revealed and beauty created. And we are to create that beauty and to spread that beauty in our churches, in our families, at our places of work, in our community, and on and on. For Christians don't have to shield ourselves from this fallen world. Right? We can embrace the ugliness of this world and accept it. We don't have to turn from it and run from it and cover our face and our ears and pretend like these atrocities don't take place. Neither should we turn from the beauty of the world and be inspired by it. We don't have to shield ourselves from it because we know the redemption which is to come. So the beauty in this world point forward to the way that the new heavens and the new earth will be, the beauty that we will find there. The ugliness of it points forward and cries out, as Paul says in Romans chapter 8, that the entire creation cries out for redemption. So when we see ugliness, we say, that's the creation crying out to be redeemed, just as our souls cry out for redemption. This day when peace will reign and all things will be made new. And so we can embrace it in all of its fallenness and continue our Father's renovation project, which began at Pentecost with the sending of the Spirit.